think back to the last time that you went to the grocery store. For me, that was yesterday. And everything in my cart, with the exception of fruits and vegetables, was scanned utilizing a barcode. UPC, Universal Product Code. At the end of the transaction, I paid the cashier my money, and I may have scanned my preferred customer card, depending on which store I went to, which surprisingly has a universal product code on it as well. This one transaction has a variety of data. On the bottom of the transaction, it tells me how many products I've purchased. If I've used my preferred customer card, it also tells me what discount I received as a result of using my card. But utilizing my card now ties all of this data to me as a customer. Does anyone know the very first item that was scanned using the Universal Product Code?
Was it blood?
It was not blood. It was Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum. Because the tiny packet, the concern was whether or not the scanner would we would be able to print on something so tiny. And then secondly, whether or not we would be able to read, the scanner would be able to read that tiny barcode. Well, obviously, we figured out how to do this because look at the tiny print on our preferred customer cards. In the subsequent 40 years, what has happened has been an absolute explosion in data. And businesses are struggling to make sense of all of the data that they have. In fact, a new phrase has been coined called big data. Big data is simply this. It's the volume of data that we have, the variety of data, the different types of data that we have, and how quickly do we get the data. Let's put big data into perspective. Walmart, the organization, looking at just their customer information, qualifies as big data. Every hour, just on generating all of the information on its customers, Walmart produces 2,560 terabytes of data in an hour. Now, I can't get my head around that, but let me help you do that a little bit better by saying that all of that data is the equivalent of all of the information we have collected in the Library of Congress since the Library of Congress's inception, multiplied by 167. And Walmart produces that just on their customer base every hour. If you're someone that's trying to understand all of the data that you have, that amount of data is overwhelming and organizations are drowning in it. Their solution is to implement business intelligence. We're going to talk about what business intelligence is. Okay? To do that, let's talk about Target. Target implemented business intelligence and it went through and identified buying patterns for customers. Okay? Now, I don't know about you, but when I go to the grocery store, pretty much every week I'm buying the same thing. And most customers tend to do that. The times in which we change our patterns is when we have a significant life change, such as a birth, moving, getting a new job. Then we change and we're changing our entire buying pattern for that temporary life-changing event. Well, Target identified that moms-to-be have a tendency to purchase the same 25 things. Lotion is one of those things. Vitamin is another. And by identifying those 25 things, what Target did was say, oh, you've hit to our Target pattern. We're now going to send you coupons for baby Leia items, diapers, cribs, because that's where those life-changing events are going to take place. And if I can get you in the door purchasing those, then I've increased my revenue. Well, as a data analytics specialist, as a business intelligence specialist, this is great that I know that this is the capability that I have, that I can identify a pattern within my purchases. I work in the oil and gas industry. There are no pregnant moms out there. Well, there are, but my customers are the oil and gas companies. And finding that 25 buying pattern is a little more difficult, a little bit more challenging. And I'm sure if you're out there trying to implement business intelligence within your internal audit department, what you are saying is, Becky, this is great. Target did this. It's wonderful. But what about me? How does this apply to me? Well, that's what I was doing, and I was asking that same question also. Today we're going to talk about what is business intelligence. We're going to go through some of the key terms related to business intelligence. We're going to talk about the lessons learned during implementation, because during Halliburton's implementation of business intelligence within the internal audit department, we had a lot of rough starts. But those rough starts, as we all know, are the times when we pick ourselves up, tie the belt on a little bit tighter, we learn those lessons and we move forward. And that's what we're going to share with you today. What did we do wrong, and what did we change our game plan as a result of what we learned? Business intelligence has 4 key component parts. It's data collection and warehousing, because a lot of our information is not all in the same spot. So we have to gather it in one spot so that we can do reporting against it. We're going to talk about reporting and alerts, and we're going to look at some data visualization tools so that you get an idea of what that is. And then we're going to talk about the stronghold where internal audit has really kind of developed, which is the data analytics and data query. Business intelligence is not one software, one application, or one tool. It's a combination of a variety of tools in order to do this. And so in a lot of organizations, one of the things that you will see will be several different applications in order to get the end result. As internal auditors, as accountants, we are always building reports. We're always working on pulling in information from one source, pulling one report, pulling information from another report. We do VLOOKUPs, we produce a little bit of magic, and we get the end result. Within business intelligence tools, what we look at is say, if I'm pulling this report from report A, and I'm pulling this information from report B, and I'm doing a VLOOKUP, let's let the computer do that for us. Instead of us manually doing this process, we're creating a program, and the computer does this every single time, and I get the same result. That way, if you pull my revenue by district, and Yvette pulls revenue by district, you're going to get the same result time after time. Whereas right now, with all of the VLOOKUPs that we do, we may not get the same information because there's a lot of manipulation that we do personally. Business intelligence allows us to take the reports that we currently already do and move them from a manual process into an automated process. Data visualization allows us to see things in a variety of ways. Once we determine how we want to see that data becomes, we're going to see that data in the same way every single time. Interestingly enough, a lot of the softwares have the ability to map that data by country, by region, by district, by store, and break it down. The great thing is, you're going to see that information on a color grid, you're going to see those colors gradually, depending on what that risk is. If I'm developing an audit plan, which country does it look like I want to visit first? Saudi Arabia. Because that color is darker, alerting me to the fact that that's a higher risk in my audit plan. I'm able to see visually what I used to see numerically. When I go to do the actual audit, while I'm looking at Saudi, data visualization allows me to look at those risk factors. What is my revenue by customer? What is the product sales that I'm doing? And when I start off with the global view, I'm allowed to drill down to Saudi And all of my charts update with Saudi information. Before, I would have to run those reports individually. Now the system does that for me. That's the great thing behind business intelligence, is that we have to figure out what it is that we want the reports to look like. Once we have done that, then the computer does that automatically every time for us. Data analytics and data querying has become my lifeline lately. This is where I speak really, really well. Now, I'm not expecting you guys to read that code on the screen, but it looks like any other IT code that you might have in any other programming language. What we do in data analytics is we identify those patterns similar to those reports, and instead of creating a report for me, if I'm going out and I'm auditing manually and I'm looking for vendors that don't have phone numbers, I may have had to pull that information, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and do some manipulation of that spreadsheet. Now I create a report. The report gathers that from my accounting system and spits out all of my exceptions, and I can look my exceptions one by one. Data analytics allows us to move from manual processes into automated processes. Well, that's great. What we've shared has been a lot of the tools. And the trouble that we had at Halliburton was we had a lot of scripts written. We had about 50 scripts when I moved into the data analytics team. But we weren't gaining any traction and we weren't really experiencing any success. The fact of the matter was there was a lot of things that kind of were holding us back from that success. I started going to conferences, and every single conference I would attend related to data analytics, the room would be packed and it would be standing room only. I would go up to the presenters afterwards and I would say, how do I get started? What script should I be building? What audit test should I be looking at? And every single person without fail to run the duplicate payment script. Now, let me take that down a little bit. Duplicate payments is pretty much what it says. To identify a duplicate payment, the pattern that you're looking for is same vendor, same dollar amount on the invoice presented to us, and then a similar date. Vendors have submitted the same invoice twice. And because we're so overwhelmed with all of the data, we've paid both invoices. Now, there may or may not be fraud involved in that transaction, but at the very least, we're entitled to that credit back for that second payment. And everyone told me, duplicate payments, you're going to receive a very nice recovery. You're going to be able to earn your investment back in the software that you spent because you're going to go to your vendors and get that credit back. We had the script. It wasn't working. We'd run it. We'd go out to every country, and we weren't getting any results. Nothing was showing up as an exception. So I'd go back to the next presenter and say, okay, the data duplicate payment script, it's supposed to be doing this. What are we doing wrong? We had specialists come in and look at our scripts. You know what we found? Our accounts payable department had 3 years prior to audit, moving into the data analytics world, had went out and hired a data analytic third-party consulting group to create that very script that we were trying to do. So when we ran our script, clean, absolutely clean, nothing on it. How discouraging was that? This is the one script that was supposed to give us what we needed. Here's a lesson learned. Find out what the rest of your organization is doing in the realm of business intelligence. Our supply chain has their own business intelligence department. Our marketing and research department, they each have their own. Internal audit has their own. No wonder our scripts aren't producing anything. Everybody else is going out there and cleaning up their stuff before internal audit gets here. Here's how we adjusted that game plan, just a little bit. We sat down and talked with each one of the departments, and we said, what reports do you have? The second thing that we did was we asked them if we could utilize their reports. Because those reports are only good if people are out there cleaning them up. If they've got exceptions and they're not cleaning them up, well then by that point, when internal audit comes in, you're fair game. Because you had the opportunity to go clean it up yourself, and you didn't. Everybody was very, very willing to let us utilize their reports. Then we sat down and said, what are your reports doing, and what are your reports missing? And guess what? That third-party vendor report was missing quite a bit. It was only looking at the very simplest of invoices. But people that are committing fraud, well, they're smarter than your average bear. And they're really good at it. Once we identified what the third-party report was doing, we could come in and develop a different report. And as I was telling Mary Ann earlier, we went down to Trinidad earlier this year and caught $1.8 million in fraud.
Wow.
Once we identified that there was a pattern that was missing in the third party's report. The other thing that we asked everybody was, what is it that you want us to look at? Because when we look at what you're wanting us to look at a global level, then we can build those reports accordingly. The first thing that we had to do was get buy-in from the other departments to figure out how we needed to go audit through the business and intelligence realm. I said we had 50 scripts when I took over. At the beginning of this year, we had 50 scripts. Not one of them gave us, as we talk in audit, an audit observation, meaning not one of them had a finding that we could write a report about. Well, it's not about the number of scripts that you have. If your end users are not utilizing your scripts, if they're not doing anything with the data that it pulls, then you've created 50 scripts, and that's exactly where we were. The whole point behind business intelligence is that business intelligence takes all of this data that we receive on a daily basis, and it cuts through the patterns, and it analyzes where we should be looking. But the reports that we had spit out just row after row of exceptions, and our audit group didn't know what to do with that data. To them, it was just more data. Here's how we combated that. The very first thing that we did is we had to go back and build our documentation and tell our audit team, this is what it means when these reports dump out. The duplicate payment report. We had to say, if you get line items, you're pairing, these are the two duplicate reports that you have. We get to go back to the vendor and ask for the money back on the second one. So we developed a functional documentation to tell everybody what it was that they were looking at. We developed how-tos on how to analyze that data. What should I be looking at when we're looking at those lines of data? And we built decision trees. Because those lines of data, it's just a lot. So which lines do you want to look at? Where are the biggest bang for the buck? Where are you going to find the fraud? Where are you going to find the audit exceptions? The second thing that we did was we started building a data-driven decision culture. Meaning that we had to look at the data differently than we had been looking at the data before. We had to be talking about the key ratios that the operations talk about when they're talking about what's happening in the organization. We needed to talk about not just what made up inventory, not just inventory turn, but we needed to talk about what made up inventory turn, what made up day sales outstanding. All of the statistics that the organization operates under, we needed to break those down and look at those pieces individually. End user acceptance, we didn't have it. Unlike a lot of other information technology implementations, whether the end user uses that software or not, doesn't really matter. They have other means in which they can do their work. But in a business intelligence environment, when you shift from from a manual process to an automated process, you've now taken away that other means in which they have to do their work. So they now have to buy into it and understand how business intelligence works. Here's what we did. We changed the management structure a little bit. In building a script, we now have an alpha tester and a beta tester. An alpha tester develops a script and then tests it to make sure that the data is the way it's supposed to be, and they hand it off to an experienced auditor who then goes and tests that. Okay? This is how our how-to scripts get built. This is how our decision trees get built. It's through the alpha and beta testing. We have to develop how we want the auditors to approach the data reports when they get developed. The second thing is we added a level of training. Every year, or every month, we have a day of training with our auditors, and we would train about how do we go audit, what things are we auditing against. We added data analytics as one of the pieces we were training. So every time we brought out a new script, we sat down with the auditors and said, this is our script, this is what it does, this is the exceptions. The interesting thing was, before we did this training, the auditors would go out to the location and they would say, I don't know how we got this exception, it's magic. They would actually use that term and that phrase. Since we started the training, now we're no longer talking about magic. We're very clear about what is happening within data analytics in those reports. We developed a data analytics team. Now, in our audit group, we have subject matter experts on order to cash, on purchase to pay, and on inventory. Those specialists help us design what we're auditing. But we didn't have one for data analytics. We had our scripters, and our scripters had no audit experience. It should be some key indication where there was a breakdown. Immediately, we added auditors to the data analytics team, and together, this team decides what scripts we're building. They also are quite often that alpha tester. Our data analytics team is very, very interested in figuring out how data flows within the organization. So the key to having people on your subject matter expert team, they have to be interested, they have to be kind of techie, and they have to be able to speak geek really well. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we found was we pretty much fit the same pattern as every other group that tried to implement business intelligence. We were very, very focused on the technical aspects of this project until about a year ago. That may be one of the reasons why, as Tammy said in the intro, business intelligence projects have a higher failure rate because we often focus on the technical aspect pieces. John Potter is a Harvard professor and has studied quite a few organizations as they go through change management process, and he has developed an 8-stage change framework. In this, John has said, these are the things that you need to do in order to have a successful implementation. I'm going to take a moment. I think we've got some thumbs out on this one. The biggest thing that we learned in our implementation was not that we needed to learn more technical aspects, but we needed to add the human element into our project. Here's the things that we were missing. Surprisingly enough, we did not have a vision. We were creating a script. We had no clue which script we were going to create next. Whatever script, whatever program struck our fancy, that would be the one that we would work on. We had no game plan. As a result, nobody knew what we were doing, including us. Pretty scary, but that's how we did for 2 years. Once we identified what the game plan was, we communicated that out through the audit group and the rest of the organization. They needed to know what we were doing and what we were looking at. And in that communication of that vision, one of the first things that we sat down to do was say, okay, I can automate this script and take it from manual to automated and let the computer do it. But that's not very sexy. There's no excitement in that. The excitement is creating a script and where you're identifying a fraudulent pattern. Our game plan is now, I'm going to automate one script so that I'm taking this time off your hands so that you can go work on this fraudulent investigation where we're actually going to find something. The third thing that we did was we weren't celebrating our wins. We didn't know what they were. We had no game plan, so we weren't really too sure when we were succeeding. But the coolest thing was, remember that duplicate payment script that I told you about? Well, we went to Canada and ran that script and caught a fraudulent vendor. What the vendor would do would be submit an invoice with the regular date, 12/31/2018, in U.S. data formation. And then they would take that same invoice and submit it European style with the date first, 31/12/2018. Well, our accounting system didn't recognize that as a duplicate payment because the dates were different. $400,000 worth of fraud, and we are no longer doing business with that vendor. But it's because we changed the script. And when we had that little woo, we celebrated because that was something nice. Our data analytics team was actually doing what it was supposed to do. The very last thing that we did, and I say this to my team all the time, is I really wonder what happens if we get hit by a bus. Because if you get hit by a bus and you haven't documented what you're doing, what happens with the information you know goes with you. If you leave the company, let's put it better, if you leave the company, if you win the lottery, and you leave, the information you have garnered goes with you. And all of a sudden, we don't have stability, we don't have sustainability anymore. Going back to those decision trees that we talked about, going back to those how-tos, that provides us with sustainability. If I should leave the organization tomorrow, my knowledge base will stay with the organization because we have developed this long-term sustainable project. Let's think back to our grocery store visit. How much information was on that receipt? A lot. We have customer information, we have vendor information, we have product information, and if you're Walmart, you have figured out that if you put Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum at the front of the store versus the back of the store, it's going to sell more because you have that information. The explosion that we've had since that very first packet of gum was scanned has been tremendous, but it's just in its infancy. What is expected on what is on the horizon is artificial intelligence. A lot of the things that I talked about when I was a manager for an audit team was I could have an accountant used to do this. It would be very routine. I could move it down to an admin, and an admin can do this task. Well, guess what? We're replacing that admin with a robot. Super macros are coming in and replacing humans on patterns that repeat. I bring this up because that will then start the next wave of what we do with data analytics and programming. And like most of us, we'll probably head off and build that very first spot. But I hope we have a game plan. I hope we know how we're going to document that game plan. And going forward, I hope we have sustainability behind that. Because the biggest lesson that we learned within Halliburton's internal audit department was it wasn't about the technology. It was about the humans that were implementing the technology. Thank you.